Hey guys, welcome back to the shop for another Metallurgy Monday. I'm trying a little more conversational format for this content, and talking about metallurgy, it can be a wide-ranging subject and it would be easy to get off into a lot of rabbit trails. And I try not to do that, but if it's more of a conversational type deal, then maybe that'll work a little better. I don't know, we'll see how it goes. I just want to mention though that this is not going to be like the main purpose or thrust of the channel going forward. I'm not trying to replace the previous type content that I was making. This is supposed to be in addition to the typical content. And if I'm going to do it most Mondays, then that might help sort of be an anchor, you know, a regular feature on the channel here. I haven't done a lot of normal content recently, and the main reason for that is YouTube views and revenue across many different channels has kind of changed or gone down a little bit, and so over the last couple of years, and so the time that I spend on that, you know, it is an economical decision, economics decision for me. You know, if I spend 10 hours on a project and doing a video and get, you know, X number of return on that, but I could spend 10 hours doing something else and get more, twice that, you know, that's just a basic paying the bills math kind of a thing. So I haven't been on YouTube as much doing normal content, but it's not going away, and everything is sort of a long-term deal. I feel like I'm perpetually behind. Maybe you can relate to that. But this metallurgy content is something that I can kind of sit down and talk about because I've done a lot of back preparation, so to speak, and so I don't have to build a project. I've already kind of done the building when it comes to that, if you will. So that's by way of explanation on the channel here. The goal with Metallurgy Monday, just to reiterate that, is to gather the good metallurgy information that's out there in regards to knife making and bladesmithing, and sort of boil it down or refine it down into an easily digested and easily put into practice set of information for you as you're working in your shop building a knife, you know, forging stuff, that kind of thing. That's the goal with Metallurgy Monday, and it's been a passion of mine for a long time, the metallurgy behind bladesmithing and knife making. So it's just something I enjoy talking about as well. Now, I'll talk about, you know, all this kind of stuff, and my wife complains about having to listen to me talk about carbides and this kind of thing, and so I can just talk to you guys via the camera and save her some of the pain and suffering of listening to me talk about bladesmithing metallurgy. So today we're going to talk about quenchants, and you know, specifically there's three things I want to talk about or cover. We're not going to be able to cover everything about quenchants in a video today in a reasonable amount of time, but I want to talk about what they do specifically, and then talk a little bit about what is an appropriate quenchant for the project that you're working on, which is obviously going to vary. So first of all, what do quenchants do? Well, obviously they cool steel down, and that's necessary in the hardening process of a blade when you're heat treating it. But we need to be more specific than that, because the temperature, or the time lapse is important. So how quickly it's cooled is important, is what I'm trying to say. The speed at which it is cooled, particularly in the first section of time, right at the beginning, is important. I think I kind of butchered that up a little bit there. So you can cool a piece of steel or a knife down with any number of things, but if it's not cooled at the appropriate speed, in the appropriate sequence, then it's not necessarily going to provide the results that you're looking for, or get the most out of the steel that you're working with, which, don't know about you, but doesn't sound very great to me. So I want to grab this triple T diagram that I sketched out. It's a very stripped down version, very simplified. Any actual triple T diagram is going to have a lot more information on it, but this is just to show the basics here. And we've got the temperature, and then we've got the time lapse, which is exponential. And then over here you're going to see something that looks similar to this, and this is the area within this time and temperature continuum that the steel is allowed to turn into the phase of pearlite. It will be able to, and it will convert to pearlite, the pearlitic phase. And the reason that's important is because we don't want pearlite in the edge of our knife. Now, in some heat treating practices, there's pearlite in the spine or the body of the blade, but there's really never a case that I could think of where you would want pearlite in the edge of your knife, because it's simply not good for holding an edge. It is a softer phase of steel, and it's just not good for an edge. So this right here, and we talked about in the last Metallurgy Monday, is what's known as the pearlite nose, and that's because if your steel runs into here during the time and temperature continuum as you're cooling it down, if it gets over into the pearlite nose, it will form pearlite because it's allowed to cool down slowly enough to do so. Once pearlite has formed, there's nothing you can do to correct that except for heat it back up to austenitizing temperature and then cool it down quickly enough to avoid forming pearlite again. You can cool it down super fast from here to here, and that will do absolutely nothing to change what's already formed up here. So austenitizing temperature is usually somewhere around here, and the goal and the necessity is to cool your steel from this point down past the pearlite nose. And I want to say that's somewhere in the neighborhood of like 800 degrees, maybe a little higher, but you can look at a triple T diagram for your specific steel that you're working with. It's going to tell you how much time you have to cool it down from austenitizing down to the point where you can miss the pearlite nose. And that is the function, the primary function of a quenchant in bladesmithing or knife making, in the heat treating of a knife. Now, as I mentioned, this is going to be different depending on the steel. I always use I like to use the comparison of 1095 and 01 tool steel, which have the same amount of carbon content, but some different alloy components in 01 tool steel. And the time that you have to cool the steel down to miss the pearlite nose in those is very different. On 1095, it's less than a second, and then on 01 tool steel, I think it's almost like between 5 and 10 seconds, almost 10 seconds, I think. So extremely, very different when it comes to heat treating. And of course, the reason for that is that the alloy components in 01 tool steel slow down the migration of carbon within the structure of the steel. And so as you pull it out of austenitizing temperature, instead of quickly moving out of the crystalline structure of the steel, the carbon can't move quickly because of those alloy components basically block it or drag it down, so to speak, simplistically put. And so you have a lot more time to cool it down quickly and trap that carbon in there, and then allow it to form martensite. So how do you pick an appropriate quenchant for your steel? Well, yes, I pointed out that you can see how quickly that steel needs to cool down from austenitizing down to missing the pearlite nose, but the difficulty is that there is no like cross-reference that I'm aware of. Maybe somebody's come up with something like that now, but I'm not aware of it, and I haven't seen it in the past. You can't really look at the steel like I have to cool it down this quickly, and then jump over here to on a little graph or chart and find the coolant that you need, the quenchant that you need. Part of that is because several reasons. First of all, the commercially available quenchants that knife makers use most of the time, and that's what's recommended because they're designed for quenching hot metal. Those quenchants were not developed for knives; they were developed for commercial use, and typically, often, the pieces that they're quenching are of larger cross section, often irregular cross section, and that kind of thing. But they weren't designed. The point is, they weren't designed for knife making heat treatment specifically. Sorry, got a little bit of allergies going on here. Secondly, the classification or the sort of the way that they judge or classify quenchants has no relative bearing to bladesmithing either. It doesn't really have a bearing on any specific part that you might quench. And so you've got these different quenchants out there, these different commercially available oils that will be described as a 7 to 9 second oil, or a 10 second oil, or 11, or 14 to 20, or whatever. These different these time periods, and that does not have a direct correlation to this speed at which it needs to be cooled down, at which your blade needs to be cooled down. What that time period of those seconds are is an old classification system that I think one of the major automobile companies came up with decades ago, if I remember correctly. And that was where they took a nickel ball of a specific size and suspended it from a wire and heated it up to a specific temperature, which was around 1600 degrees, I believe. And then they would get a beaker of quenching oil, the specific oil they were trying to study, and it would be a specific volume, and then on the side of this container or beaker they would have a magnet. And then once the nickel ball was heated up to that specific temperature, they would submerge it in the oil, and as soon as the nickel ball had cooled enough to become magnetic again, or magnetically attracted again, it would swing over to the magnet and stop the clock. And so that is the 7 seconds, the 10 seconds, 14 seconds that you see when you read the specifications on a particular quenching oil. So the inherent question is how do you translate that to how fast of a quenchant you need for a particular type of steel for a knife? The answer is really just more practical. There's a number of steels that are actually classified as water quenching steels, and you actually see that in the name. W1, for example, is considered a water quenching steel, as opposed to, say, O1, which is an oil quenching steel. And the difference, of course, is the alloy components that allow for a longer period of time to cool it down from austenitizing and allow it to turn into martensite. But there's a lot of other steels that are similar in the necessity for an extremely fast quench, and that would be 1095, 1080, 1075, and so forth. Now, the reason that most people don't use water to quench these steels is because it takes a longer learning curve, I think, and it's more difficult to do. There's a lot more room for error, and I've been actually quenching. So I've been working on a style of knife here for a while that I'm quenching in water, and it's a lot tougher. Like, you can't just put it in the oil and then you've got a pretty big leeway as to when you can pull it back out, and it'll be fine. With water, you have a very tight window between, comparatively speaking, between when you quench it, get it cool off enough, and then when you need to pull out before it starts warping and even potentially cracking on you. Whole other subject, but the point is that water is not commonly used for quenching blades. And another example, and another reason is they're thin cross sections, which are more prone to warpage and that kind of thing. And then, of course, we're dealing with high carbon steels that are capable of reaching higher levels of hardness than, for example, 1045 or 1060 even, where, like in the 1045, you quench that in water, you're still not going to reach the same level of hardness that you would on a 1060 or 1075 steel, because there's just not quite enough carbon to do that. But that's what makes it tougher, and so for the right application, it's great. So practically speaking, you're going to use the next best thing to water for these types of high cooling rate steels. And the industry standard, the one that everybody knows about, is Park 50. And I think in the description it even says, it approaches water in the quench speed or cooling rate. So it's not as fast as water. So the question is, can you really achieve full hardness with an oil on a steel that actually requires the speed of water to quench it in? And I think there's some more variables to the question from the study that I've done, and the answer is yes and potentially no. And that lies in how much steel are you trying to cool down. So if you're taking a 1/4 inch blank that's just profiled out and you try to heat treat that, chances are you're not going to get full hardness through that piece of steel using a quenching oil. Conversely, if you do a rough grind on that blade, if you're you know, doing stock removal, or if you forge the bevel down to, you know, maybe 2/3 of what the finished thickness of the bevel is going to be, you've got a much thinner cross section, you know, even like half or less, particularly at the bottom half of that blade where the cutting edge is going to be. And so your ability or chances of achieving full hardness with that thinner piece of steel is greater. And this is a thing. I think Dr. Larry Thomas talks about that in some of his literature. Now, of course, if you're using something like O1 tool steel, that's really not an issue. That's going to harden through in the oil because it's got a much greater time lapse where you can cool that steel down from austenitizing down to where it can begin to form martensite. And I should point out, these are known as deep hardening steels. And then these steels that require a very fast quenching are known as shallow hardening steels. So I'll just share with you what I use, because it is true that a couple of different quenching oils are going to cover the vast majority of your high carbon and even your high alloy steels. I use Parks 50 for, of course, I don't use 1095 hardly anymore, but 1080 if I use that, which I also don't use very often. 15N20, but I typically use that in conjunction with another steel for pattern welded steels. But in that case, I will still quench that pattern welded steel in the Parks 50 so that the 15N20 has the opportunity to fully harden, because I don't want to build a blade out of 52-100, for example, and 15N20 and then quench it in AAA, where the cooling rate is adequate for the 52-100, but not for the 15N20. And quenching, you know, I've had absolutely no issues at all quenching 52-100 in Parks 50. It doesn't need that fast of a quench, but it's totally fine, and it works just fine in conjunction with the 15N20. So I use the Parks 50 for that. And if I'm working with any kind of 10 series steel or W1, I use that on occasion. I use the Parks 50. And then I have a tank of AAA, and of course I'll use that for the 52-100. The O1 tool steel, which I don't use a lot of that, but it's a good steel. And when I do, that's what you use. I'm trying to think. I think you can also you can quench 80 CRV2 in the AAA, but again, typically I use the 80 CRV2 in a Damascus blade, and so I'll be quenching that with the 15N20 in the Parks 50. And so that's just kind of a rundown of what I do in my shop. And so you can see how a couple of quenchings covers a pretty broad range of different steels. Until you start getting into the high alloy steels and the stainless steels, you don't really necessarily need to worry about different types of quenchants. So you might be wondering where you get this stuff. Well, most knife making companies have some kind of quenching oil, but you do need to make sure that it's the right one, because some knife making companies will sell quenching oil and it doesn't specify what speed the quenching oil is, so you're going to have to do some additional research in some cases with maybe the company that manufactured it to find out what the speed is. And you know, so you can't just use one quenching oil for any kind of steel. And so, you know, it would be helpful if it was very clear what the speed was. But you can specifically find Parks 50, and you can specifically find like AAA and then the equivalents of AAA. There's some other ones out there, and purchase those for the particular steel that you're using. You need to have enough oil to absorb the heat and maintain an operating temperature that's proper for continued use. And so if you're doing several knives, you know, you want at least a couple of gallons. I like to run, I want to say probably between 4 and 5 gallons in my tanks, depending on what it is. And then I've actually got, you know, a full 5-gallon metal pail that I use for like the hatchets and stuff too. And that would even be better if it was bigger. That's even a little bit small for that. But again, if you're just doing one little knife, then that's not necessarily a huge issue, but you got to be careful that you don't exceed the operating temperature and keep trying to quench knives in it. It's not going to operate, it's not going to function the same way, and it also can, as it gets hotter and hotter, those vapors are more and more prone to flashing, and so having adequate quantity of oil, quenching oil, is important. Some people might be interested in alternatives that are inexpensive and even more easily acquired, and maybe they don't want to spend some money, that much money out of the gate, if it's just a hobby or something they're looking to get into. And there's different things you can use out there, and probably the most common is the old canola. The Canadian oil, low acid. The canola oil does actually work as a quenchant for knives for specific steels, and so the canola oil is about the equivalent, as I understand, of a 10-second oil, so something comparable to AAA. And so you can take your 01 tool steel or your 5160 blade, but not your 1095 blade or your W1 blade, and quench it in canola oil and get a good result. The difference is, one of the differences is that it's not going to last like a quenchant, like a commercially developed quenchant. Those are designed to be reused over and over and to withstand and not break down under that repeated use, whereas the canola oil is not going to do that. Also, many quenching oils have an engineered component to them, to where this crucial point at which the cooling rate needs to be a certain speed is engineered to happen at that speed, and then once it drops below a certain temperature, the cooling rate continues to, or slows down a lot. Now, that is not as big of an issue, because if you're doing what's known as an interrupted quenching, where you quench it down to the necessary temperature and then remove it from the oil, then that's not as big of a deal, which I recommend doing it that way. In industry, of course, they don't necessarily have the opportunity or ability to do that. If you're lowering a giant crane or something with 100 parts on it into a vat of quenching oil, you're not going to be able to just snatch it right back out of there again at a specific moment. And so there's some nuances there that you can work with. Yeah, canola oil is an option for deep hardening steels, because it is a slower quenchant than like Parks 50 or water. If you've ever used motor oil for a knife quenchant, raise your hand. I've done that. Do not recommend it. Don't do that. It's toxic and leaves a really cruddy thing on your knife. But yeah, it will cool down the steel and make it hard with the right steel. So anyway, but yeah, don't do that. Just go get some canola oil if you're going to do that. It's cheap, and it'll work for a little while. All right, guys, well, I hope this discussion was helpful. I know it was kind of wide-ranging and rambling, but I kind of tried to cover sort of a general foundation of knowledge for anybody who might not be familiar with the subject, or just maybe even making knives for a little while but wants to know more. And in my opinion, you continually, you're always learning. That's one thing I really love about this, and there's always something to learn and progress. Like, I can do this a little bit differently and get a little bit better result, and just build on that and get to where we're making the best possible knives that we can with the materials and the things that we're using. So it's fun, it's cool. So I hope this was helpful to you guys. I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you on the next video.